So I want to welcome everybody to this month's Provider Network meeting. First item on the agenda is Department of Health and Human Services updates from Margaret Alwine at DHHS. So Margaret, you can take it over.
All right, thank you, Lori, and thank you, everyone. Just wanted to provide a few updates for you and then happy to take any questions you may have. Wanted to make a reminder that we have both a waiver renewal and several amendments that are posted and out for public comment. This includes renewal of the head and spinal cord injury waiver, or HASKI waiver. As a reminder, this particular waiver has just a little over 1,040 participants currently enrolled. It does allow for multiple services, and I'll talk a little bit about the updates in the renewal. This also applies to the waiver amendments for other waivers. We are reviewing our primary caregiver or family caregiver policy. We are proposing to update that policy to allow any primary caregiver that is not a legally responsible individual to provide self-directed services. So this will be limited to self-directed services, but allowing some flexibilities that have been in place through the public health emergency to allow for legally responsible individuals to provide self-directed services. There is a distinction in the definition of legally responsible versus legal guardian. So I do not want anyone to conflate those two terms. This basically would allow for those individuals that are not legally responsible to utilize their own funds and provide for the care of the individual receiving the waiver services. We are also proposing to create a consolidated nursing service to allow more flexibility in service coverage. This would consolidate what we currently have for those waivers that do have waiver nursing to consolidate RN and LPN into one nursing service. Again, the intent is to provide for some additional flexibility and service coverage within the scope of practice that is required by the Nurse Practice Act. We're proposing removing the age limit for the HASKI waiver from the eligibility criteria. We have included an increase in the number of waiver slots, also an increase in the reserved capacity numbers. And then, as with any waiver renewal, we will be updating quality performance measures, our appendix that outlines our costs and rates, as well as the cost projections in Appendix J. As we have to demonstrate with all waivers, we have to demonstrate both in the application and each year during its waiver operation that it is cost neutral. That means that the average per participant expenditures for the waiver and non-waiver Medicaid services are no more costly than an average per person cost of furnishing institutional services for individuals who require the same level of care. The HASKI waiver renewal, again, is out for comment. It is on both the DHHS website, as well as there is a link to it on the DDSN website and multiple other partners' websites. The deadline for comments for the waiver renewal is March 2nd of 2023. I mentioned additional waiver amendments. So we are also seeking public comment for waiver amendments. This will impact several of our community long-term care waivers, as well as IDRD and community supports. Again, we are looking to consolidate services, provide a more cohesive and streamlined service array, and update cost projections, as well as recent cost actions. I mentioned the nursing consolidation. We are also seeking to consolidate personal care services into one personal care service. That will include revisions to the service definitions and updates to provider qualifications. The same recommendations concerning payment for waiver services furnished by primary or family caregivers. Again, this is for self-directed services and allowing for individuals that are not legally responsible adults to be able to provide self-directed services. Updating along with that, updating for those waivers that have personal care to allow for a self-direction option for personal care. And then updating the various items for which we have provided rate increases over the past 6 months. We are also evaluating the individual cost limit in Appendix B for community supports. And for the waiver amendments, again, these are all posted, and the deadline for comments is March 8th, 2023 for the amendments. Again, March 2nd for the Haskey waiver renewal. I also want to call attention by way of updates. We recently completed our review and issuance of one-time direct care retention payments. We also, in response to some questions that have come in, we have issued a frequently asked questions document to assist with any further questions related to the one-time payments. That was published on or around February 3rd and is available on our website. So if you have any questions related to the HCBS one-time direct care retention payment, please refer to that FAQ document. And if you still have questions or have additional questions, we will be adding to this document. So please feel free to send that through the Medicaid waiver mailbox, which is monitored, and we will collate and add any additional questions that come up. That is directly related to the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, HCBS spending plan, and the one-time direct care retention payment. It is a separate payment aside from those that were issued for the retroactive rates for DDSN boards back to July 1 and the bonus payments. So 2 totally separate payments at a little bit of a same time frame. So please feel free if you have questions. If they're related to the retroactive rate adjustments, I will be directing those to Jeff Saxon's area. If they're about the ARPA HCBS one-time payment, you can send those directly to the Medicaid waiver mailbox. I will also make mention that we have had some questions as we are coming up almost on a year of our since our transition to direct billing and fee for service. We're continuing to evaluate changes made in association with that, as well as the changes implemented with the waivers that began in concert with that. One of the questions that we are seeing come in has to do with leave days and how that applies to specifically to residential habilitation. At the time that we implemented, we agreed to continue to utilize current policies, which provided for a maximum of 73 leave days, or that's up to 20% of days of a year during the service plan year. So we did implement the 73 days to be roughly analogous to current processes, accounting for 73 leave days, or roughly 20%. There is the capacity to request an exception for an individual that incurs leave days in excess of 73 days during a service plan year. The process for that would begin with submitting that request to DDSN. It should include adequate information to identify the reason that additional leave days are necessary. So just wanted to make mention of that. We did add a modifier, L as in Lima, V as in Victor, to ensure if you are billing leave days that they can be tracked and reported. Wanted to revisit. I know there's some questions. There is a process for requesting an exception. We did have to establish and thought it best at the outset to be somewhat analogous with the existing policy. And so wanted to make mention of that. And if there are exceptions, there is a question in the chat as to whom at DDSN that would go to first. But as always, we're open to reviewing items that we may need to review from a policy perspective. But that is the current requirement. I may pause and see if Lori has any direction as to how requests should be routed or exceptions to leave days.
Yeah, you guys can send that request directly to me. I actually do the leave report that comes to you. It gets sent out by Yolanda. So you can send it to Yolanda or to me. The thing I'll point out is we know where people are with leave. So I don't need just a list of people that are getting close. We need information about the leave that's already been taken and the purpose of that leave, and you will need a projection for future leave needed during the plan year. So like, if somebody has used 69 days and they have a planned leave for another 7, then you're going to ask for 3 additional leave days, right? So we need kind of a pretty specific requests for how many more, why leave's been taken, what leave is going to be taken after that, so that we can make a recommendation to Health and Human Services about approval of the exception.
All right, I'll hit just a couple of more topics and then I will see what questions we have in the chat box before I turn it over. We had some recent discussion and questions around electronic signature requirements. I want to direct folks, at least on the Medicaid policy side. There is a signature policy section within our administrative and billing guide. If you look under the provider section on the DHHS website, pull up any provider manual. Within the links to additional documents, you will see an administrative and billing guide that was designed to be somewhat universal, which means it applies to all of our provider manuals. And within that document, you will find signature policy, which also includes some requirements around the use of electronic signature. I believe that's around page 24 or so, but a quick search of that document will put you in contact with our current signature policy. So in the event you have questions on electronic signature requirements as it pertains to Medicaid, that's where you would find that guidance. All right, so a couple of questions that have come in from the chat. Anything related to the retroactive rate adjustments? I would follow up with Jeff Saxon. He would have any of that detailed information. So again, anything related to the retroactive from to 7/1 that should go to Jeff Saxon for any of those adjustments. And then a couple of questions on the request for exceptions. I believe that's referencing the leave day policy. Again, there needs to be enough detail as to how the allotted 73 days have already been used and what the justification would be for a request to accept for additional leave days. There is a question about renewals for your legacy numbers. I'm not quite certain if I understand the question. If that has to do with the waiver ID or provider ID that you were assigned at the time that you enrolled directly with Medicaid, that provider ID, unless there is some instance of change of ownership or another mitigating circumstance, those provider IDs would remain the same. If there are any individual questions based on a particular circumstance, we'd be happy to take that question and get further information. But if there have been no changes, then that provider ID would remain. I will also make mention, since this just came to mind, I believe DDSN has put a request out for any input or request as it pertains to the waiver contracts. That is a document that both DDSN and DHHS both reviewed and approved. So for those waiver service contracts, if you have input or changes that you would like to recommend for the upcoming year, please get those in immediately. We'd like to make sure that is a timely process, and we need any of your input so that we can review, make any requisite changes to the contract template, and have those ready to go for the upcoming year. So I'll put a plug in. If you have any input to send to us for the contracts, please do so.
I will say too, as a kind of a aside with that, I know that the provider groups, the HSP and the coalition are trying to get their comments kind of consolidated. It doesn't mean you can't send comments on your own, but I encourage you to reach out to, I know Michelle Schaefer's involved. I'm not sure who else, but you could reach out to the HSP or to the coalition if you want your comments to be considered as part of that kind of group comments that they're looking at sending in to us.
Yep, anything consolidated, we certainly appreciate. I did see an additional question in terms of rate actions effective January 1. We did issue a bulletin related to rate actions for the January 1 date. I'm currently trying to pull that bulletin up. It was issued, I believe, posted on December 7th. And that includes some updates for CLTC waivers. It also includes updates that were made for rates related to adult attendant care, companion services, waiver nursing and state plan nursing, personal care, in-home respite, and in-home supports. So that, again, that bulletin was posted on December 7th and effective January 1, 2023. And I would hope that the bulk of this audience are registered and receiving bulletins automatically. If not, there's an easy subscribe button on the DHHS website. The way that we communicate any of those rate actions is through issuance of a Medicaid bulletin. So please make sure you're on the distribution list for any and all bulletins. Finally, I will mention that there's been a good number of questions about ICF direct billing. This is specific only to community ICFs. We have begun meeting in a structured manner with DDSN every other week to tackle this topic and outline a project plan that will help us narrow in on what we think is a feasible timetable for transitioning community ICF to direct billing. There have been several of you to offer to participate in piloting that effort, and I thank you for that. As soon as we have a little more detail on the project plan and some anticipated timelines, we will be reaching out on that. It will have a very similar look, although billing practices and trainings may look a little different based on how this billing occurs, but we intend to follow a similar pattern as we did for the waiver fee-for-service transition to direct billing. So that will include some training sessions, materials, list and checklist of steps to help everyone along the way. So we anticipate a fairly similar approach to training and support as we did for the waiver service transition to direct billing. All right, I think those were my main topics. Again, we appreciate your partnership. Please feel free if questions arise to send those through to the Medicaid waiver mailbox. And had one question come in. We do not have any further follow-up. We had a question. There were a ton of different funding streams and sections under which ARPA funds were made available. So we have some follow-up questions that we're taking a look at, and I'm sending to our one of our other teams in the agency, specifically the question related to Part C ARPA funding and BabyNet. So I don't have an answer today, but I have sent that on for that particular area to ask about. So thank you for the follow-up.
All right, thanks, Margaret. If you don't mind staying on just in case anything else comes up as we move through some of these other agenda items. We did get several questions submitted to the Provider Forum mailbox, which I really appreciate you guys doing. So we've kind of split those questions up into these general update areas, and we'll try to address them as we move along through those, because we had several of kind of similar questions, so we kind of put them into basic categories. So next on the agenda is the title of case management update, which kind of encompasses a lot of things case management related. I did want to provide an update related to conflict-free case management. As you guys are aware, we are on schedule as a state to transition fully from conflict-free case management by the end of the year. So by the end of December, we owe you guys a kind of a heat map of where the cases are that are still in conflict. I want to encourage any provider out there who has not submitted their update to us to do that immediately. We've been individually sending out reminders to providers. We can't provide a heat map statewide until we have an update from the provider network so that we know who's still in conflict. In addition, we really just want to make sure that we have accurate information before we publish it. One of the challenges that we're having with conflict-free case management and now is capacity within the provider network. We are running into multiple situations where we have providers that are unwilling to take cases. So as you will remember, we kind of are working We are working to build some waiver case management specialists, state level case management, state case managers at DDSN to try to bridge some gaps. But what has happened because of the capacity issue is we actually have those people working some cases, which we never really saw them as a long-term solution. We really wanted to use that group to help support the provider network during transition times or during very difficult situations. We're seeing providers not want to take cases, want to send cases here because they feel like they can't work them right now. So we've got some capacity issues. We've been talking about it with HHS and, are going to kind of move towards trying to do some provider recruitment to get some new providers within the network. And or coming up with a way to expedite qualifying those providers, just because we've kind of got to get to a situation where we can serve the people that we have. Janice Moore sent out some information to case management providers about where they are accepting referrals. I encourage you guys to make sure that you fill that out and send it back in so that we can see where the issues might be. But conflict-free case management kind of falls into all of that, right? Because if I can't find a provider to serve people who are coming up that need case management, I also am not going to be able to find a place for those people to go that need to be deconflicted. So it's kind of this, this snowball of a problem. So with all that being said, we've brought it up at the case management work group. We have another case management work group meeting tomorrow where we'll talk again about any kind of brainstorming for how to address that issue. I know that hiring is an issue for many of you. It's an issue for us too. We've been trying to fill 8 positions for about a year, and I think we're up to 4 or 5. So, we're all struggling, and unfortunately, we're all pulling from the same candidate pool, which I think kind of causes some other issues, right? It's an issue for you guys. From our perspective, if someone applies for a job and they are qualified and we would like to hire them, we absolutely are going to do that. I think there's been some information that I've heard anyway about DDSN actively recruiting people at providers. If you know of that occurring and you know who is recruiting, I would appreciate that information. And that's a me thing. So if you'll give it to me, we can address it. There's been some questions about pay differential, and DDSN is a state agency and we operate under state pay bands. So, we have constraints in HR that are around state defined positions and pay bands. And that's what we're working within. From a provider network perspective, you don't have those pay constraints. We don't tell you what you can or cannot pay people. So, that's kind of all I can really say about pay. We don't even get involved with HR stuff from our perspective because it is a full state HR kind of thing. So we are more than willing to continue talking about it with providers. But at the end of the day, we need people, you need people, the system needs people, obviously, right? Because we've got a capacity issue. So, we want to continue to work through those things. There was a question about inactive cases and providers receiving funding for the intermittent work that you do for people that don't get ongoing active case management. I'm going to add that to the case management work group meeting tomorrow, which is kind of a group where we can all have discussion. That's an issue that's been looked at a couple of times, a couple of different ways over the years by DDSN. I'm perfectly willing to look at it again if it's, you know, something that you guys are doing that is kind of time that you're spending that you're not being compensated for. So I just want to say I'm adding it to that agenda if that's something that you want to bring and talk about kind of the challenges you're seeing there, how much work you're doing, a way that we might be able to fund that kind of thing, then, you know, I'm totally willing to listen and think through that. Margaret, I was going to stop and do questions because that was my kind of my case management update. No, wait, I have one other thing. One other thing about case management updates. Many of you know that the president has issued a notice that the public health emergency will end on May 11th, 2023, right? What that means in the world of service delivery are a lot of things, right? There's the Appendix K, which is kind of one standalone that has many flexibilities within it. And the Appendix K is going to have to be unwound, for lack of a better way of saying it, over the course of 6 months after the public health emergency ends, no more than 6 months. So we're meeting and planning and trying to figure out what we're going to do related to Appendix K, how we're going to wind up those flexibilities and that kind of thing. The other thing is that no participant has lost eligibility for Medicaid, just basic Medicaid coverage. That's waiver, non-waiver, ICF, whoever, over the last 3 years, unless they've died, moved out of state, or you know, really, I think those are kind of the only two reasons, right? So you kind of have this group of people that have stayed in Medicaid eligibility that may or may not continue to be eligible for Medicaid. They could have more than the resource limit. They could be in a TEFRA category and they've aged out and they haven't applied for another category and they're sitting in a TEFRA category, right? So there's kind of all these things happening. So that is something that's super concerning, right, for families, because Medicaid funds so many of the services that the people that we support receive. So we've been planning and meeting and talking, and you know, Margaret's been great hooking me up with, you know, her team as well as kind of the eligibility team over at HHS. And we're working on some plans to try to push out some training and information to the provider network. So on the horizon, look for a few things. Number one, we're designing a training for case managers. And really that training is around helping families identify that they got a reevaluation packet in the mail. By the way, HHS is going to start doing Medicaid reevals April 1st. If, again, like Margaret said, if you get bulletins, you get bulletin. So beginning April 1st, people are going to start getting these reevaluation packets, and they need to fill them out. They need to turn them back in. And the other thing is that we're going to try to design a training that is specific to residential providers, because so many of you have points within your agency where you're actually helping people fill out those reeval packets. So we want to try to give you some information about things that you need to look for. Medicaid is working to try to give us a list of waiver participants at the least who are in certain categories, so we know where reviews are going to be targeted, like which people. And then as well as they're going to try to give us a little bit of heads up about the people who participate in our waivers that are coming due for review, because they kind of have this plan to review all the people over a year's time frame. So again, that was a lot, but I want you to know that there's a lot that we're trying to do to prepare for the end of the public health emergency, and kind of what that means to the people that we support, as well as what it means to you as a provider. Because if you have 10 people in your residential program and they fall out of Medicaid, we got to have a plan for how those 10 people are going to be supported from a financial standpoint, like kind of all the way around, and come up with policies and procedures around that. So, all right, I'm going to go into some questions. Margaret, there's a question about electronic signatures. I don't know if you see that question, or if you can.
I do. So again, this is written from the perspective of many different provider types, and to be inclusive of signatures required for referrals or orders for some services, medical documentation that's required, as well as requirements built in billing. So recognize that this captures kind of the whole universe of potential requirements and uses for signatures. It does outline that for the documentation, it should be signed, and this is more regarding medical documentation, but must be signed by the author unless otherwise specified. It does make mention of the individual whose name is on the alternative method, but then also lists a listing of options for documenting an electronic signature. In these instances, it does include many that also include the provider's name. So we'd be happy to take a look if there is a lack of clarity for any individual instances, but electronically signed by and the provider's name. I think by provider, we may need to be a little more specific because we think of providers as individuals rendering a service, but we can also think of provider agencies as well. So we'll take that back to take another look and see what clarity we may need to bring to that policy.
Okay, there's a couple of other questions, but I think we're going to get to them as we move through the agenda, and I'm going to kind of leave them up here. So for people that have these pieces of the agenda, if you'll just make sure that you get to them when it's kind of your turn. I'm also going to do some updates around authorizations. As far as my agenda, it's not on there, but we tried to update it this morning. Okay, good. So you guys can probably see it as part of the agenda. So I wanted to give you a couple of updates around authorizations and talk through some questions that we got that are kind of authorization specific. So first off, there was a question about service and unit frequency and why authorizations are written at certain frequencies to providers. So from a Medicaid perspective, case managers are required to include amount, frequency, and duration of services in the plan. So if the plan for Quincy is that he's going to receive 25 hours a week of personal care, the plan reads that he needs 100 units, because units are 15 minutes for personal care, 100 units weekly of the service for however long he needs it. If it's the duration of the plan, it just runs the duration of the plan. So that whole units and frequency is done based on assessed need, you know, how much Quincy might need. It's been that way for quite a long time related to service delivery. There are certain services in the waiver document that have to be written at specific frequencies. For example, personal care has to be written weekly. Respite has to be written monthly. And the reason that it's in there under that frequency is because there's kind of these soft limits written in, and the limits are written into those frequencies. there, in the past, there have been services that are written to a yearly frequency. Yearly frequencies might be necessary in very extreme circumstances, but here's the caution with a yearly frequency, right? If Quincy is getting personal care and I write that Quincy needs 100 times 52, right? 5,200, right? If I write Quincy's authorization for 5,200 units of personal care, there's nothing to stop Quincy or the provider from the delivery of all those services being done during the first 2 months. And then he comes back and goes, I need more, right? So when you look at assessed need, it's really hard to determine an assessed need over a year's time. Now, I do understand that sometimes things come up and there's flexibility that's needed for additional services that might need to be provided for somebody. My thought there is, number one, that needs to be built into the assessment on the front end. And perhaps we need to go from weekly to monthly in authorizing the service. So I think specifically, I've had this question a couple times about SLP1. I would be hesitant to be able to approve an SLP1 amount on a yearly basis because, you know, we need to make sure that we're using the service the way that it's assessed to be needed. But we could look at it on a monthly perspective, or we could look at, do we need to increase the weekly amount to account for maybe, you know, a couple of hours extra because this person might have a doctor's appointment on this week and not on that week, right? So I say all of that to say providers really didn't think about it in the past because you got a band payment and you just kind of reported what you did, and we billed what we could and didn't bill what we couldn't. And so that's what happened. But this kind of is back to that whole ability to provide services to people in a retrospective manner. So the next question that came in, oh, let me say this too. One of the other things about a yearly frequency is, and really any frequency, everybody has kind of struggled with this whole proration of units on the authorization. So the prorated, the way that Therapp prorates yearly offs are by time frame anyway. So even if we wrote it yearly, as soon as we have to update an off because of a rate change or anything like that, it's going to prorate it as if you're using the same amount of service every day. So another question came in around state funded services and whether or not DDSN was going to update state funded service rates to coincide with the Medicaid service rates for Rehab Day, that kind of thing. My understanding is that a back payment has been issued from 7/1 to the December 1 when they were changed in the Therapp system. That payment was based on the documentation in the Therapp system of delivery of service. So as you recall, the method for getting paid for state funded services is that you have to enter that attendance data into Therapp, and that attendance data has to come in with your invoice when you bill for state funded services. So we actually used what was in Therapp for that time frame and provided you with a payment. That payment might have come into another payment that you were receiving, right? It wasn't kind of a separate payment and earmarked as a back pay. So if you have questions about what you received, when you received it, you can reach out to LaKenya Craig or Carol Mitchell, and they can provide you with that information. All right, I'm gonna look and see if I have any questions. So there's a question about family support and whether there's a process in place to request additional family support. I think the process has always been that you just send something in if you anticipate you're gonna run out. We look at that funding, we can maybe readjust it from another agency that hasn't spent theirs. I think you guys are sending in monthly, I don't know if it's monthly or quarterly, but there is like a process where you send in summaries of what's going on with family support. So there's a question about back payment for state funded case management or MTCM invoices. Those rates did not change. There has been no rate change for MTCM, and MTCM, the state funded case management rate is based on the MTCM rate. So you would not have received a back payment for either one of those. All right, my last item on the agenda is the residential needs update. I think I told you guys before, this policy actually lives in operations right now, but I have kind of been trying to manage a lot of what's happening with the policy and the day-to-day monitoring of the SCOM box within my area for a while. It is going fairly well at the moment. I think case managers are learning a lot as we move. We have tried to be as helpful as possible to people related to the process. We do know that the process is going to need some adjustment as we move forward. I think we kind of said that when we did the training. We have developed a new form or an adjustment to the form that's used by case managers to provide information to the residential needs box. And we are currently piloting that at a few locations, I think, or with a few people. We will continue to do that. We likely are going to bring a work group together in the next month or so to start talking about what is working and what is not working from both a case management and a provider perspective. I know this has been a big learning curve for everybody. It's been a big learning curve for case managers. It's been a big learning curve for providers. But I go back to when we move to a fee-for-service world, we cannot have provider-driven request for services, right? The request for service is assessed and requested by case managers who are globally assessing somebody's needs and providing that information in order for a group of people to approve stuff. While I say that, I understand that from a provider perspective, it's very challenging to try to go to the different case managers and be able to get done what you need done. So we'll continue to work through that. I'm always willing to talk through it with folks. And I will do what I can to help you anytime, you run into an emergency kind of situation. So with that said, I think that's everything for me. And I think you are next related to quality management updates.
Yes, thank you. So as Lori mentioned, we are transitioning the ADT process with the Residential Needs Committee. And I wanted to let everyone know that the key indicator requirement within the provider's contract compliance review process will be deemed non-applicable going forward. So Alliant will not be asking you for copies of your ADT forms going forward. In addition, the SLP1 assessments need to be sent to the SCOM box for residential needs assessment so that that team can review the information for placement. We've had a recent question about unannounced visits to SLP2 settings that are housed within a community apartment complex or just otherwise located in the community and not as part of a provider-controlled complex. We've had questions about whether the third shift unannounced visits were required, and DDSN will not require the third shift visit to an apartment in this particular situation, similar to how we do not require the third shift visit to an SLP1 or CTH1. We do expect the provider to test the availability and the response of the staff assigned to provide support. So according to the standards, you should have staff available to respond within 15 minutes, and we do expect providers to test that response. Providers need to review their medication technician certification process and ensure that the quarterly oversight is provided. This is a frequently cited indicator, and DDSN will be following up with providers to ensure that the oversight is in place. The death reporting process is transitioning as we would expect. We've had some bumps along the way, but I think the process is working out. There are some providers that are doing exceptionally well with the community-based reports. In particular, I would like to give kudos to Rich Lex and Max Abilities, as their reports are very thorough. Other providers have struggled a bit more to provide the information that we need. Please be sure that you are selecting the correct location of residence for the individual. If you are selecting at home with family, then there are fields that you're not going to be required to complete. If you are selecting any other setting, then those fields are going to pop up as mandatory fields. There was a reference sheet that was provided to case management providers back in November. I would encourage you to refer to that reference sheet. And if you continue to have questions, please reach out to qualitymanagement@ddsn.sc.gov. We have seen a lot of issues related to Appendix K, particularly if the face-to-face visits did not take place as required. This is a policy violation. We need to know how you as the provider are addressing this particular issue. Also, the administrative review is intended to report the death, but also to ensure that the policies set forth by the agency are followed. The administrative review looks at the participant services and any concerns that have been noted during prior monitoring visits. The purpose is to ensure that any concerns for health, safety, and welfare were received appropriate follow-up. So this would include staff interactions and also follow up on medical care, whether it was directly impacting the death or not. Please do not check no for corrective actions required if there were no face-to-face visits or if there were unaddressed medical needs that were identified on the person's plan. At a minimum, there will be training opportunities. The requirement for case managers to report deaths for all waiver participants living in the community or at-home settings is the first step in the transition to require reports for all incident management reports. This includes allegation of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and critical incidents. DDSN must meet performance measures established by CMS for participation in our home and community-based waivers. As the revisions to the incident management directives roll out, case management providers will be required to report for all waiver participants, not just those in residential or receiving a service at the time of the event. The requirement is for waiver participants. And of course, the requirements have always been in place for ICF ID participants. Providers may simplify the reporting process by submitting reports for all individuals and their caseloads. DDSN is able to support the data. We are able to sort the data from these reports by the participants' individual waiver type. I also wanted to mention that DDSN will start a mortality review process next week. This will include an additional review for deaths that were unexpected or unexplained. Please be sure that your staff are submitting addenda to incident reports. As part of an end-of-year reconciliation effort, we cleaned up about 150 records where providers did not submit an addendum. This includes reports from the ombudsman, and we found 5 reports where staff were arrested as a result of the allegations. Upon receipt of the ombudsman's closure letter, the provider must submit an addendum that indicates the correct disposition. We found many examples where providers had attempted to close out a case. The addendum stated case closed, but there was actually a verified standard of care finding. So please make sure that as the addenda are submitted, the correct disposition type has been indicated. This process will be more clearly stated in upcoming revisions to those directives. There have been a lot of reports that have been returned for additional information and clarification. There is a specific security role within the incident management system for executive directors and or their designees. When reports are submitted, the ED or designee must attest by use of their PIN or their electronic signature that they are submitting complete and correct reports. Please ensure that the staff to whom you have delegated this responsibility are fully reviewing the reports for content and clarity prior to submission. And finally, Lori, I will address a question about Identigo. So we had a question about whether or not the background checks through Identigo could be transitioned to providers. And as much as we would love to be able to do that, state and federal requirements will not permit us to do so. We've actually looked into this and there's just no way for us to make that happen. The process is managed through the DDSN Human Resources Division. And if you have any questions regarding your background checks, please email backgroundchecks@ddsn.sc.gov. So there is a question about whether other waivers require death reporting criteria that DDSN requires. Yes, the CLTC requires include all critical incident types.
Which is kind of where we're moving.
Yes,
That's
it
the
is.
point, right?
Yes.
So, you know, with the debt, I understand it's a challenge for case managers, but it's going to end up, you know, being the same challenge around critical incidents and abuse as we move forward.
Yes. So there is a suggestion that we might have a separate field for individuals who live in the community but pass away in a hospice setting. Currently, the format is requesting or requiring SLED notification. That's something that we can certainly look into.
Yeah, we might even think about updating the kind of the place of residence or whatever, so that we would, you know, anybody who was not receiving residential or in a day service, that it wouldn't catch those, so. All right, are you all done, Ann?
There's a question that just popped up about whether Identigo is the only option to use. And I believe they are the only entity contracted by the state of South Carolina to do those background checks. it's a state procurement issue, and I think they may be the only vendor.
Yeah, I think, you know, we understand the problem, and I think it might be worth looking at it again from a direct enroll provider standpoint, at least for Medicaid services. And I think we can commit to just looking at it. Like we're good to see if there's a way around it. So. Yep, I think Harley, you're up next.
So I have some really quick communications update. We had a few different questions come in that relate to communication. So I'm just providing updates around those. So one question we received was related to trainings and DDSM procuring a learning management system, or LMS. So DDSM is contracted with Inelectability as our LMS. Currently, the person-centered planning trainings, Fatal 5, and choking trainings are available for providers. Inelectability are currently in the process of rolling out communications and more widely contacting providers to ensure that everyone who wants access has access to these trainings. We will also continue to work with them to provide additional content for providers. Medication administration training and incident management reporting are two that are currently prioritized. And we hope to continue developing trainings with Inelectability into the future and welcome suggestions from providers for trainings that we can tackle in the next year. So the question was about the just learning management system in general and our plans for it. And so I wanted to provide that. And so providers, y'all can utilize that for your own planning purposes, but also as a way to that we can work with y'all to create trainings that are going to benefit you and your staff. Another one has already been addressed, but it was around contracts. So again, you know, working with the provider organizations to provide group comments on contracts or edits on contracts is helpful, but you're welcome to share those individually as well. And you're welcome to send those to me directly and I can help facilitate that. My email address is harley.davis@ddsm.sc.gov. And then a final communication related question came in regarding provider input being sought by DDSN. So I wanted to just share that this meeting is an example of a forum where providers can provide input to DDSN and talk with staff regarding policies and procedures. And y'all did an excellent job. I just want to thank y'all so much for sharing all the questions that you did share. Really helped, I think, give this meeting a lot of meat, and also was an effective use of everybody's time to go through all these questions with all the providers participating and DDSN staff, you know, knowing where the issues are and being able to address them and work with y'all. And I did want to just remind y'all that, you know, if y'all have input on directives, you can provide that at any time. It doesn't have to just be when the directive has been reviewed internally and is out for public comment. Those directives are out there. Anytime input's received, you know, we can address it and or use it as an opportunity to review and revise that particular directive or policy. And so please continue to keep the questions coming into the forum agenda and FAQ email address, and we'll continue to provide these updates and let those questions drive the topics for the meeting so that it's the most effective and efficient use of everybody's time. So that's all for me, unless y'all have questions.
All right, so we're at the questions, additional remarks section of the agenda. I want to apologize. There's a question that I had not seen or addressed so far. So there's a question about independent living skills service that was added to the waivers earlier this year, or really last year. No, I don't know the exact date, but the policy and standards for that service are in draft. They're being worked on between DDSN and DHHS. The real trick to that service is standing up a provider qualifications process so that we can have providers to provide the service once the standards and policies are written. We're currently looking at some creative ways to try to qualify providers kind of in the future. So stay tuned for that. We hope to address the issue of provider qualifications for everything pretty quickly. And I think you'll see the independent living skills service get moving once we kind of have that process in place. The other thing I wanted to remind providers about is that we do plan on having an in-person meeting in March for this forum. We will send out some information about that. We obviously are going to have to limit to make sure that we have enough room, right, for enough for the people as we move forward. So we will we'll do the best that we can to try to plan for that ahead of time so that it's the most effective use of everybody's time. I am looking forward to seeing everybody because I haven't seen many of you in a while. So if there's no other questions or remarks, I think that is the conclusion of this meeting. Like, oh, what, Harley?
There were some other questions that came
Oh,
in.
sorry.
I just don't know if we're gonna, I mean, I'll let Lori look at them.
Yeah, I think we got some questions kind of right before the meeting.
And if there are things.
So if there are things that we can, how do we get the retro payment? So there's a question about billing HHS for time, billing now for time where stuff was, the rates are wrong in Therap, right? So I think that's a question for Jeff and Margaret. I know that we had a discussion about the need to go back and do retro payments for a period of time in order to allow for just what you're saying. Like if I send in a bill today for October through Therap, it's going to pay at the old rate because I'm going to submit it at the old rate, and MMIS is set up to pay at whatever rate you bill. So they kind of know that that is out there. Margaret had to get off of this meeting because she had a 3 o'clock. So I will make sure that they know that you guys would like them to address like what their plan is for that going forward. There's a question about whether you can just do it through the web tool, and you absolutely can, right? So if you're billing through the web tool and you're billing for the old rates, you can put the correct rate in there whenever you submit it. So it's not a big deal. The breakdown around retro amounts calculated, that's a Jeff question, not a us question. We can certainly speak to any state funded service and tell you how we calculated that, when we paid you, that kind of thing. That's the thing I was saying, contact Carol or LaKenya. There's a question about wanting access to something in Therap related to their BI feature. I can certainly take that question to Therap and see if it's something that is included in our contract, but we can only give you access to things in Therap that we have under our contract with them. If an agency wants to contract with Therap separately to get features that we don't contract for, you are certainly welcome to do that. So I think that's everything. All right. Like Harley said, thank you guys for sending in many questions for us to consider and kind of talk through prior to this meeting. I think it was very helpful to us to think through what you wanted to hear, and very helpful to you so that it's not chaotic with people sending in the same question, many different times during a meeting. So we really appreciate it, and we encourage you to continue to do those things. There's a question about the best way to get in touch with Jeff. I think you have his email address and his phone number. That's really the only communication that I have for him. So. All right, thanks again. I hope everybody has a great day.